Good afternoon. I'm Raleigh Flynn, the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, a nonpartisan think tank based in Philadelphia. This afternoon, in our People, Politics, and Prose series, the host of this program, Ron Granieri, is going to be talking with Elizabeth Samet, who is the author of a new book, Looking for the Good War, American Amnesia and the Violent Pursuit of Happiness. As always, we will be taking your questions at the end of the program, but I encourage you to go ahead and start putting them in the Q&A box as we go along, because occasionally I know Ron reaches down and pulls one of your questions into the formal program. So please go ahead and use the Q&A box whenever the spirit moves. Ron Granieri is an FPRI Templeton Education Fellow. He's also the Executive Director of FPRI's Center for the Study of America and the West. Also the host of People, Politics, and Prose, and he's also an associate professor of history in the Department of National Security and Strategy at the U.S. Army War College, which behooves me then to give the following disclaimer that anything Ron says today are his own personal opinions and do not reflect the views of the U.S. government, the U.S. Army, or the U.S. Army War College. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Ron Granieri.
Thank you, Raleigh, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us this afternoon for this episode of People, Politics, and Prose, FPRI's conversations with authors about their works, their careers, and the ideas that drive them. We're all delighted to have you join us live here on Zoom and recorded on YouTube. It's a pleasure to have you with us. We tell stories. We tell ourselves stories in order to live, according to the oft quoted and just badly quoted by me aphorism from the late Joan Didion. What is true of individuals is no less true of societies. We construct narratives about our history through a process of selective commemoration and careful forgetting to comfort us in the present and perhaps guide us in the future. Few stories have as much power as those about the wars we have fought and the generations who fought them. We may choose to forget those things too painful to remember, sand off rough edges, and cover painful realities with gauzy comfort, but the stories tell us a lot about ourselves as we tell them. In her new book, Looking for the Good War, American Amnesia and the Violent Pursuit of Happiness, Elizabeth Samet offers a meditation on the power of war narratives in shaping both the American self-image and our analysis of subsequent conflicts. Samet is especially interested in the Second World War as the good war, against which all subsequent conflicts have been measured, and the alleged virtues of the greatest generation who fought it. Using history, memoir, and popular culture as sources, Samet highlights the contrast between the concrete realities of the war and its subsequent transfiguration in American memory, especially since the 1990s. In revealing how Americans have chosen to remember World War II, she also reaches further back to that other iconic conflict in American history, the Civil War, which, she writes, quote, continues to bleed freely across the national imaginary. Throughout the book, Samet offers a clear-eyed analysis of how Americans have chosen to remember war. Even more, she forces us to confront the reality that such memories are indeed chosen and constructed. As she concludes, quote, the so-called greatness of the greatest generation is a sentimental fiction, suffused with nostalgia and with a need to return to some finest hour. It's ironic, she points out later on, that in a nation once billed as the great nation of futurity, there's a particular irony in dwelling so stubbornly in the past. That Americans seek comfort in a particular vision of the past reflects a discomfort with the present that has only grown over the past 3 decades, as subsequent conflicts have failed to produce the kind of clear and satisfying victories we think we remember. Quote, in the midst of a miserable peace, Samet concludes, the pains of war are quickly forgotten while its imagined glories grow. So what does it mean to call World War II the good war? How did American understanding of that war change over time? What consequences flow from the combination of false memories and bad historical analogies? These are some of the questions that we will address today in our conversation with Dr. Elizabeth Samet, who is a professor of English at West Point and the author of No Man's Land, Preparing for War and Peace in Post-9/11 America, as well as Soldier's Heart, Reading Literature Through Peace and War at West Point, which won the Los Angeles Times Book Prize for Current Interest and was named one of the 100 notable books of 2007 by the New York Times. She's also the author of Willing Obedience, Citizen Soldiers and the Progress of Consent in America, and the editor of Leadership, Essential Writings by Our Greatest Thinkers, as well as the annotated memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant and World War II memoirs, Pacific Theater. It's an awful lot of work, and she is the recipient of a National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholar Grant and the Hyatt Prize in the Humanities, and she was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship to support her work on looking for the good war. And we are delighted to have her here with us today to talk about her work. Welcome, Dr. Elizabeth Samet.
Thank you so much, Ron. I really appreciate the invitation and look forward to talking to you about the book.
You bet. And I will also add, as Raleigh extended the disclaimer to me, I will extend it to you, that all comments that you make are your own opinions and not those of the United States Army, United States Military Academy, or anybody else except Elizabeth Samet.
Thank you.
You bet. So, Elizabeth, is there something especially American about how Americans have chosen to remember the Second World War?
Well, I think every country that participated in the war has a particular memory of it and has wrestled with that memory over the ensuing decades. I think of France, Russia, Germany chiefly, but we have chosen to remember it, I think, in a very particular way. The war itself was such an aberration in so many ways. The existential threat posed by fascism, the unequivocal necessity of our participation, the decisiveness of the Allied victory. Those are only, I think, the most obvious elements. But that victory left us in a surprisingly dominant position. And I think Reinhold Niebuhr, in The Irony of American History, addresses this most clearly, but in a sense, sort of surprised by where we found ourselves. And I think our tragic post-war mistake, and this is what the book focuses on, was in thinking that the consequences of World War II could be endlessly duplicated. So over the years, we have somehow developed a capacity to be surprised when the use of American force doesn't establish, as it once did, a new world order, but instead seems to end in quagmires or in inconclusive and wasteful expeditions.
And so that gets to that question of, what's the harm in remembering things badly? The United States, as one of my former colleagues at FPRI, Adam Garfinkel, was fond of saying, right, the United States, American society is funny because we're one of the few societies where when we say something is history, we're essentially saying it doesn't matter. But so what does it matter if we get history wrong? If wrong's the right word even.
Well, if we think of myth as getting history wrong, or at least turning history into something else and omitting certain things and shaping a narrative, first of all, I think we have to acknowledge that that we're hardwired to do that, that it is a necessary and fundamental human trait. I also think that myths can give life, as I write in the book, to nations, can give nations identities, and they are essential in crafting those identities. But in this case, the particular myth has a double edge, as I think most do. And it's that in creating this myth and in using a vocabulary that we inherited from World War II, we frame every conflict in a similar way. And the world is not the same as it was as we left it in 1945. And yet we keep recycling terminology. So fascism becomes Islamofascism. The Axis powers become the axis of evil. And we think in this Manichaean way, inherited from that earlier period, arguably intensified by the Cold War, of course. And we then imagine that similar results will ensue. And I think the most dangerous, because the most flattering and inspiring part of the myth is the idea that when Americans engage in war, they do so as righteous liberators. Mm-hmm. And so the language of liberation always attaches to our conflicts. But as we can see, that's not always the consequence of our use of force.
Right. Well, and well, I'm sure we will circle around this, but I'm going to go ahead and ask it now to get started. And that is, we assume, and we know that while people are fighting wars, they know just how terrible they are. But it takes a while after the war is over then for different memories to come into play, and for that to create these sorts of positive narratives. How should we understand the process by which this happened? Because there were some veterans of the war were involved in changing the way we thought about the war, even though they would have experienced it in one way and then they talk about it in another. But how do we think about the process by which memories are transfigured, or history is transfigured into these kinds of memories?
So I think that process, how we remember war, is similar to the way we remember other events in our past. But because war takes place at the margins, takes place in such an intense and violent sphere, that the process is even more pronounced. And there are often cases where a veteran's immediate memory of the war will be vastly different from the memory 10 years on, 20 years on, 30 years on. And I think that that's sometimes a softening of the harsh reality. Sometimes it goes in the other direction and it becomes even more bitter. I think of someone like Paul Fussell, the literary scholar whose bitterness about World War II is legendary. And I think he never lost that. And I think it really did intensify in his work. So I think it can go in either direction. I think in this particular case, in the case of World War II, it's gone in that positive direction. And I think the more painful elements have sometimes disappeared from the narrative in favor of a different picture, a more palatable picture, a more flattering picture. And I freely acknowledge the seductiveness of that particular narrative. It's hugely powerful, and I understand why. But I think that failing to see the counterpoint, failing to see the complexities won't help us as we think about the future.
Right. And I realized I already fell in the trap of talking about right and wrong, which I wasn't going to do. But when we talk about myth and we talk about myth making and myth creation, there's an implication, right? That we make certain choices, and those choices might not be, while they might be immediately comforting, they might not actually be the healthiest choices or the best choices going forward. What would getting our understanding of the past of World War II right look like? In other words, is it possible to imagine thinking about the war in a way that doesn't simply vacillate between, oh, it was all terrible or it was all great, but to try to figure out what does an honest look at a history like that look like?
So I think an honest look certainly acknowledges the necessity of our participation and also the justified nature of the Allied cause. It acknowledges an enemy, particularly in Nazi Germany, of unimaginable scope and horror. It acknowledges all those things, but it also has to acknowledge less clear things, like an alliance with the Soviet Union, which would then, an enemy that became a friend that became an enemy again. The complexity of all of that. What did it mean to have an alliance with Stalin? And I think in the myth, how we solve that problem is sort of ignoring the fact that we had that alliance and talking about other alliances, talking about the French, talking about the British. So that's one element of that. Another, I think, is a clear distinction between causes and consequences. So what has happened is that the consequences of our involvement have sort of been backdated as causes. And we see this in various places. But the United States did not go to war to save the Jews of Europe. Did Allied forces ultimately liberate the camps? Yes. Were we ever motivated by that? No. But that has slid now into a cause, a righteous cause. Truman commissioned the Harrison Report after the war, and he sent this envoy over to investigate what was happening in the displaced person camps. where the survivors of the concentration camps were. And he concluded that we were being unbearably cruel to the very same people we had liberated. So even after the war, we were not particularly interested in the fate of European Jewry, the way that we like to think we were. The other thing that we do is focus on the European war in favor of the Pacific War, a war animated on both sides by brutality, by a brutality that was informed by racist feelings on both sides. And that's much more complicated to think about and to wrestle with.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result of that, I think we have failed to see that all of the good, what we think of as good consequences, were achieved by brutal, violent means, and that there is no way to sanctify that violence as we have tended to do.
Mm-hmm. You know, I see a question just jumped in from Michael Noonan, and he raises the issue that, and you mentioned this in the book as well, and he mentions that the Army has recently decided to go back to World War II style uniforms, away from the dress blues back towards the pinks and greens, which is kind of a visual, let's reach back to the good old days. And so Mike asks, right, has there been much discussion at West Point about this shift, this symbolic shift, this embrace of Eisenhower jackets and pinks and greens? Does one notice this on Post, and do people talk about it?
So I have talked about it with some of my colleagues. I think to my students, it's, they don't know that uniform really.
Right. Sure.
And so I think it's pretty much invisible to them. And of course they have their own cadet uniform, although they have Army uniforms as well. I have a few colleagues, one in particular who's really enamored of this. He's got the leather jacket and he's got the Ike jacket and everything, and he's thrilled by it. And I think his thrill is somewhat attached to this kind of nostalgic notion of bringing back an earlier time. I also think it is a handsome uniform, but it is a deeply nostalgic one, and it does seem an odd time to do it. But I think that it offers a sort of a very clear sense of an earlier time when warfare was, and this of course may be another illusion, but more straightforward. Enemies were easier to identify and friends were easier to identify. And I think it also takes us back to conventional warfare after decades of something that I think we weren't as comfortable with, which was counterinsurgency.
Right. No, that is an interesting thing. And I don't know about you, but I've seen a few people make jokes where they show pictures of World War II. They show Eisenhower speaking to the troops before D-Day, wearing his jacket and wearing a tie. And they draw a comparison to, so Eisenhower could go to the battlefield wearing a tie, and yet we're sitting around our desks wearing essentially battle fatigue pajamas. And so why can't we be as cool as these old guys? The nostalgia question with uniforms is an interesting one. But and this idea about remembering the war, about thinking about what it meant, and its experience for the veteran. You have some really great sections in the book where you talk about the veteran as expressed in popular culture at the time. And there's so many different ways I want to get at this, but just your discussion of the character of the veteran. You have over your shoulder a poster from one of the great film noir of the post-war period, Out of the Past. But the idea of the role of the veteran as a protagonist in popular culture, right? It was a very ambivalent image. And I'd love to hear you tell the audience more about how you discuss it in your book.
It was, as you note, a deeply ambivalent image, and it is a counterpoint to the idea that we have also come to believe that every veteran of World War II was welcomed with open arms and celebrated. And I think that myth was intensified by what happened during Vietnam and the deep hostility toward that war and also toward veterans. And so this offered a very different picture to that. The veteran in film noir, however, is almost always an agent of instability and confusion. So often the veteran is a drifter who finds himself, and it's almost always a man, finds himself in a town often a small town, a respectable small town with its respectable people, and some crime has been committed. Mm-hmm. And it's always the respectable people in town who are the real criminals, but of course they want to pin it on this drifter. So the veteran will be detained and the detective will call to Washington for the service record, and they wait for the service record to arrive. And there's often a scene in which they'll be reviewing the service record because this is somehow going to prove that this veteran is either guilty or innocent. But it does no such thing. It does, instead, it offers us two incompatible visions. And the first is that usually the service record is good, mm-hmm. heroic. Silver stars are sometimes mentioned, Purple Hearts are mentioned. And so the detective begins to think, oh, this is an upstanding person. This is a war hero. He couldn't possibly have committed a crime. But the other thing that then emerges is that, well, how did this veteran get the Silver Star? And of course, then this notion of violence emerges. This is someone who is used to solving problems now through violence, is the assumption. And so is a likely suspect for this crime. And so that service record is always mixed, and it never exonerates anyone. It just adds to the confusion. And I think the anxiety produced by the veterans who return, and of course, millions of them did return. That's a very destabilizing thing that we forget. People were worried, would they take their jobs? Would they have more rights than other citizens? Would they be, would they demand certain things and get them at the expense of civilians? So I think those are all the factors that are revealed in film noir.
You know what's amazing is the way you described that experience in film noir of the drifter and the respectful citizen. That's even the plot of First Blood, the first Rambo movie. He is a drifter. He is not necessarily guilty of any crime. He is treated as a criminal and he responds violently. And there is a scene in that movie where the sheriff is on the radio and they say, "We just read his service record. He's won the Congressional Medal of Honor." A little bit of inflation by the 1980s. But the idea that you see this kind of sort of recognizing that life for veterans was not all that great and that society itself didn't quite know what to do with veterans. Because this, you talk about the classic film Best Years of Their Lives, which of course everybody loves. It's a very good movie in a lot of ways. Very sad movie because those veterans are not having an easy time adjusting. And so we remember the movie, but we don't always remember the fact that the movie itself tells the story of how hard it was for veterans to come back and reintegrate into society.
And that's part.
Yeah, go ahead. Please.
I'm sorry. Well, that's part of sort of a trio of movies, two less well known, Till the End of Time, and which is also about returning service members who are not integrating well, and they have to learn to be patient about a lot of different things. And Pride of the Marines, where John Garfield plays a blinded Marine. There are others, of course, but those three sort of seem to me a sort of set of films released within a year or two of each other. But as you say, Best Years of Our Lives, it has beautiful production values. It offers us in some ways, a very comforting picture of a Midwestern city. It's modeled, I think, on Cincinnati, although it's called Boone City. And the veterans' futures are not entirely sure. Mm-hmm. We're not sure that they will ever find the footing that they had before the war.
Yeah. Well, this gets into an interesting question. I see a question here too from Alan Allport, who's written a great deal on veterans coming back from Great Britain after the Second World War. And he asks, this is the idea about how should we remember this? And that is, given the recent embrace by many on the right of the America First rhetoric of the isolationist movement before Pearl Harbor, is there a danger that too much cynicism, if such there be, about the United States entry and role in World War II is to play into the hands of those who openly disavow the idea of America having any obligation to preserve liberal democratic values, either at home or abroad? In other words, we can say that we've gone too far saying how great everybody was, but does it help? Are there consequences for us downplaying the greatness when the war was important and the war was good?
Well, I think the danger perhaps is forgetting that it is not reintroducing isolationism itself into the story, the beginning of the story. This is what I mean about confusing causes and consequences. We were late by some measures, by many measures, if we want to think about this as a justified endeavor, right? If the reasons we use now to fight fascism, well, they were around throughout the 30s, and we were so committed to isolationism at that point. Not only America firsters, but I think America much more broadly. Not everyone, like the America firsters, of course, were sympathetic to the fascists, but they were. Others, I think, just didn't want to be bothered, didn't want to be drawn into European quarrels. Mm-hmm. And so that was the legacy of the First World War for the United States. And many people have said a version of this. Martha Gellhorn offers one. When she arrived at the newly liberated Dachau, she says that, she writes, "We were late, really late, and we can never let this happen again." The other storyline that I trace through the book is that of a group of people known as premature anti-fascists, or PAFs, who all had FBI files opened on them because they were labeled communists. And they, of course, went to Spain to fight the fascists. And they were among the most ideologically motivated World War II enlistees, but many of them were relegated to non-combat roles because we didn't trust them. And Bernard Knox, who went on after the war to be a celebrated scholar of the classics, who's really opened our eyes to elements of the epics and to the ancients' treatment of war as a subject of poetry. When he was told that he was a premature anti-fascist, was just perplexed. He said, "What would it mean to be on time?" Right? How could you be too soon? Right. How could you be too early to that particular fight? And so I think if we put that part of the story that we don't talk about at all back into it, we will avoid that trap that the question rightly suggested exists.
Right. And related to that, I wanted to ask you this, is that scholars are often accused of being killjoys and spoil sports, for finding complexity and irony where the public would prefer to find clarity and comfort. How do you see the scholar's role in talking about these kinds of cultural developments? And how do you see your role in doing it in this particular case?
Well, because as we started our conversation talking about, this myth has real world implications. Mm-hmm. And because the stakes of going to war are so high, I view it as a responsibility, not simply of academics, but of anyone trying to look honestly at history and to try to find a way forward in what we all know is a hugely complicated landscape, that this is a responsibility of a citizen, not just of an academic, but of citizens, really.
So of real people too, not just scholars.
Right, not just people hiding away in libraries and writing books, but of sort of understanding who we are in all its complexity, in that kind of honesty. I think of the Americans that I admire most, and they were capable of that. I think of Lincoln, perhaps chiefly, but someone who could look at history and who could see the good and the bad, and who could recognize that it was always complicated, and that it was that complication and that ability to look at it and reinvent. And salvage the good always, and try to use that to see a way forward.
Yeah. Well, and this complexity question, because I see, Ben Pributok has a question about how we should or can acknowledge the essential humanity of our enemies. And so this question of when we're trying to understand the story of a war or any war, how do we find ways in a society that wants to, there's nothing wrong with the society wanting to argue that the wars that it fought needed to be fought. But how do we talk about that in a way that also recognizes the complexity of our common humanity, not just with our allies, but with our enemies as well? And how do we see that in this story of how we talk about the war?
Well, maybe one way into that is to see the vast array of motives on our own side. Mm-hmm. So we think of everyone as volunteering immediately, let's say after the night after Pearl Harbor, signing up and immediately deciding with a patriotic fervor that this is what they had to do. And of course, that's not what happened. Things did change dramatically. But by the winter of 1942, the Roosevelt administration was worried that the country had once again grown complacent. And so that fervor was short-lived. A large proportion of service members were drafted. There's nothing wrong with that, right? It isn't right. To say that they all should have volunteered, but the fiction that they all did creates a sort of strange dynamic in our remembrance of the war and the people who fought it. So people join wars for all sorts of reasons. They also join with particular ideas in mind and may emerge with altogether different ones. So I think it's always important when we talk about the justice or injustice of any cause to think about the wide range of motives of the people fighting. That armies aren't monoliths, although they look like it, right? They all have now that uniform that makes them look all alike, but there's such a wide range. Not only of motives, but also of ways of fighting, right? And we know that.
And I guess that you talk about motives and ways of fighting and the enemies that we fight. There's a point that you bring up that is also that I've seen in other literature as well. Will Hitchcock talks about this in his book, The Bitter Road to Freedom, about liberation, about the way that American soldiers interacted with, say, English civilians when they were stationed in England, with French civilians as they liberated France, and with German civilians as they entered Germany. And how complex that was, that in some ways, because France had suffered a great deal, right? The French seemed dirty and unhappy in a way that the Germans all seemed clean and delighted to see the Americans when they showed up, which is very much of contrast and led to all this fear about fraternization. But the way that Americans at the time, American soldiers, interacted with the people with whom we were fighting, and the way they think about their experience afterwards, that level of complexity, that human complexity, do we see that in the memory of the Second World War? If we see, yeah, go ahead.
I think, and this is largely due to photographic and newsreel imagery, but I think what we see is, in our mind's eye, the GI giving chocolate bars and being kissed and given flowers and that sort of thing. And that's, of course, the most attractive version of it all. And one of the points that Hitchcock makes, of course, is that this idea that we are supposed to, something, about gratitude, right? And yes. That the devastation was such, people didn't even have the energy to display that gratitude. And there are other accounts, that suggest, if you think about Naples, for example, which suffered unbelievably during the war by the German occupation and then by the Allied advance, the black market, the suffering, the poverty, the hunger. And there are many cynical accounts of that. Burns' novel, The Gallery, is one of the texts that I treat, and it gives an absolutely devastating portrait of Naples, as do memoirs and other historical accounts, Hitchcock's included. Yeah. I think the interesting dynamic you mentioned between our attitudes toward the French and toward the Germans, which are surprising, can be seen in another kind of text that I talk about, and that's the pocket guides that were issued by the government to GIs in various countries. And there are these wonderful idiosyncratic guides written by people who knew these countries well, but knew them before the war. And so there are all these caveats about, I hope this is still available for you to see, or in better times you would have done this or that. But several books after those initial pocket guides, part of this series treating France in particular, allude to several of the things you mentioned, so that they anticipate all the complaints that the GIs will have about the French. And they explain things like the scarcity of soap, the scarcity of food, what it means to live under occupation, the psychology of that. And so in reading all of these pieces of advice and these explanations that the guide provides, you see the kinds of attitudes that GIs were expressing at the time. Similarly, or I should say, antithetical is the German pocket guide, where you have a clear explanation under a heading, why are we fighting Germany? Because it had to be explained.
Right.
It was not so clear And it's very obvious that it's based on the fact that there seemed to be some kind of kinship felt, right? These people look like us, and they seem to, and so there was, we all know the short-lived denazification program that followed the war, but the attempts to prevent fraternization, which also lapsed to some degree because it seemed impossible to prevent this. But there are strict warnings in all of those books, and the emphasis put on those warnings suggests the difficulty they were having in preventing it.
Right. Well, and a veteran's experience, an American veteran's experience of the Second World War is radically different if that veteran fought in the European theater or the Pacific theater, right? Nobody talks about giving out chocolate bars to islanders on Saipan. And so I think about that as well, right? The sense of the enemy, the sense of the conflict, the sense of what was being fought over is profoundly different in those two world wars. And do we see that difference reflected in the memoir literature and in the way that people talk about the war in the Pacific as opposed to in Europe?
I think we do. Part of it has to do with geography, but not exclusively. I think in the Pacific, we don't see the civilians.
Yeah, they just don't show up, right? They're not part of the story. Yeah,
it's as if they're not there, and sometimes they're not. If it's fighting in a sort of an island that's not heavily populated, but other times they're just not really discussed. The fact that there's fighting going on where people have had tried to live their lives. So we don't see that, but of course we see civilians all the time in memoirs of the European theater.
Yeah. Well, and I see a question coming in from an attendee about the Korean War, and this is what I thought was interesting, because you do discuss in your book that it's as Americans are trying to sort out their experiences and their memories and their feelings about the Second World War, that we're fighting another one. And you cite some works that talk about this, and how does the Korean War shape, or how does it fit into an American sense of what a good conflict is or a bad conflict, or the meaning of conflict more broadly?
I think that, and I look at some film, and I look at novels in particular. I look at the work of William Styron, who has several stories and treatments of Korea as an unwelcome and sudden interruption. He writes about the Marines, and there's one text in particular called the Long March that focuses on two veterans of World War II who had returned to their lives and had sort of just gotten going again when they were recalled to duty. And it takes place in their training. They're not in Korea, but there's a sense of interruption, a sense of confusion. There's no real discussion of the why. It's just the injustice of it all, of being called back to this thing, which they thought they had put behind them. And so the issue of cause becomes very interesting in that it's not discussed at all, at least in those sets of texts.
Right. In your book, you do talk about how the role that the 50th anniversaries in the 1990s play in shaping a particular version of the Good War and Greatest Generation narrative of the Second World War. What happened between 1945 and 1995? Was what happened by the 1990s, by the time we get to Stephen Ambrose and Tom Brokaw, was that the culmination of a process that had been gradually building, or had the process been more erratic before that?
I think the short answer is Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
That the 50th anniversary celebrations, which was nearly contemporaneous with the first Gulf War, had a lot to do with putting the ghosts of Vietnam to rest. So if we think of the first President Bush's observation that the first Gulf War had finally put an end to the Vietnam syndrome, which was a term that he and others used. And I think this rhetoric was begun by Reagan, certainly, this idea of a new kind. I mean, he had one of his slogans was about greatness, right, as well.
Right, sure.
And so it's this idea, this question of greatness, and as soon as you start talking about that, you're talking about a kind of, you're no longer in a golden age, right? As soon as you start looking back to greatness, you convey a sense that we have to recover this, that there was a falling off. So I think Vietnam, I think the Gulf War, which was this amazing demonstration of American military might, and had at least a theoretical punctuation mark, right? An end. I mean, it didn't, there was a no-fly zone. There were all sorts of things that went on, but at least it had at least in our mind, we were able to sort of put an end to it. It was a war with an end. And I think that the 50th anniversary celebrations or commemorations of the war all shared in that particular narrative of recovering a kind of greatness. The Cold War had ended. This idea that, or was ending, that this idea that all of these things seem to coincide.
Yeah, and I guess that's, I think about that because I think about the power of the passage of time, because you do mention in the book, right? We're talking about the Good War, we're talking about World War II. Studs Terkel had put together the Good War 10 years before, right? I mean, I guess is that when the first version of that book comes out, is in the early 80s, right?
Yes, around the 40th anniversary.
Around the 40th anniversary,
right?
And yet, at the same time, as you admit, right, looming over all of our memories of war in the United States is the Civil War. Even if it's 150 years ago, we still talk about it. It's still there. Can you explain to the audience how you integrate your discussion of the memory of the Civil War into your discussion of conflict? Because I see at least one question about this is how should we be thinking about the Civil War, especially going forward with the contemporary backlash against monuments and memorials and such things?
Right. If I could just go back to Terkel briefly.
Oh, please do. Yes. Yeah.
Well,
by
because
all means.
I mean, we can never spend too much time talking about Studs Terkel as far as I'm concerned, but it's really interesting to me, his title. And he says, he has a note, and I'll read it, so I'll get it right for you.
Excellent.
But he has a note to the Good War, which he puts in quotation marks. And it's, as all of his books are, they're transcriptions of their oral histories of his radio interviews. And he says, quotation marks have been added, not as a matter of caprice or editorial comment, but simply because the adjective good mated to the noun war is so incongruous. So the term Good War was clearly there, right, in the atmosphere. But to Terkel, it seemed so strange. There was still a time at the 40th anniversary when that pairing could seem strange. And of course, his collection, the beauty of that collection, of all his collections, is that it's a welter of contradiction. Mm-hmm. From rabid patriots to disillusioned cynics, from people who were patriotic and felt that this was indeed a good war, to others who said, look, the only thing good about that war was that I had a job for the first time in years after the Great Depression, right? Times were good, money was rolling in. So there are all of those things, and he never tries to reconcile them.
Right. And that's the beauty of his work, right? Yeah. When I was in graduate school in Chicago in the 60s, he was still on the radio. In the 90s. I mean, he was, of course, had been around forever, but was still doing his show. And that idea of letting people from that generation speak. And most of those people probably would have, well, let's just say, I don't know that all those people would have embraced the idea that they were part of a greatest generation, right? Even if they would have felt a certain degree of generational solidarity. So it is interesting. I think you point that out, that he's aware of the power of the story. He's aware of how important it is, but he also is so aware of the complexity that he doesn't try to resolve it. He just shows it to you by having as many different voices as possible.
Right. So onto
the Civil War. Yeah. Speaking of complex conflicts, please.
Yeah. So there's so many ways into this. Maybe I'll offer one way in just to show the strange kinds of connections between the two wars, which you see everywhere in World War II memoirs. One of the most celebrated being E.B. Sledge's With the Old Breed, and a memoir of his service in the Pacific. And there is a moment where American Marines capture Shuri Castle, And they've captured this fortress, and some Southerners who evidently have packed away a Confederate flag, have it with them, which is strange enough to me. They raise the Confederate flag. And it's a moment of triumph, clearly, like in Sledge, he sort of takes a breath. He's from the South. He takes a breath and he sees this, and he says that they raise the flag to the confusion of the Northerners, the anger of the Northerners, and the confusion, I think, of the West. I'm paraphrasing, of the West.
Right. Yeah, I remember that, the confusion of the Westerners. Yeah,
yeah.
Right, yes.
They don't know what the hell is going on.
Right.
And the Southerners are, of course, very happy. And then later on, a general comes, and it's General Buckner, actually, and who says no and raises the United States flag. But that was a stunning moment. And as I said, it's a sort of one moment of, it's not levity would be the wrong word in what is a grim and honest book, but it's an arresting moment, and it made me think of the very, very long life of the Civil War, and the idea that one would raise a Confederate flag while wearing the uniform of the United States in another century, to me, emblematizes the very confused and distorted memory of the Civil War. That we're seeing that all over now. We're seeing it with Confederate statuary. We are seeing it with a reappraisal of the way we have understood the war and the way we have understood race in America. That war was remembered most energetically and programmatically by the losers of that war, by the South. Eric Foner has said in various places that the North may have won the war, but the South won the war for its memory. And I think that that's indisputably true. And so getting out from under the burden of that particular myth has been a very long struggle.
Mm-hmm. Well, and please go ahead.
And my point about, I end with the Civil War, because the Civil War is now over 150 years old. And so it feels dead to us in a sense, right? In the past, we don't have a living connection. We have an emotional connection, certainly, and a regional connection. We don't have a living connection to the veterans. So we can perhaps look at it now, finally, more dispassionately. And using that and showing the damage that was done by misremembrance was my attempt to show that we are in a different, and I realize a more, again, a more emotional and a more personal sense. And my hope is that before this war passes so far into the past that we can no longer recover its memory, that we will be able to think critically about it.
And to think critically about it, to understand what it was fought. I was just sitting here and just thinking, was the General Buckner in the Second World War, wasn't he a General Simon Bolivar Buckner? Wasn't that also the descendant?
Yes,
a descendant of a Confederate general himself, right?
Yes.
See,
yeah, the Simon Bolivar Buckner, the first Confederate general to surrender in the Civil War at Fort Donelson, surrendered to Grant.
Right, because I was thinking about that because you also mentioned Fitzhugh Lee, and there's that at the turn of the century, when the United States begins to be a world power in the 1890s, there's a very strong desire to emphasize this is our chance for national reconciliation. That you have former Confederate generals, former Confederate officers who are brought into the United States Army to go fight the Spanish-American War. And just to add something that I thought of and I wrote in the margin when I read your book is that F. Scott Fitzgerald, before he died, one of his last literary accomplishments was he wrote a bunch of short stories, the Pat Hobby stories, about this terrible screenwriter called Pat Hobby in Hollywood, who was sort of Fitzgerald making fun of himself. And one of those stories is called A Patriotic Short. And it is Pat Hobby's been brought into Script Doctor, a story about Fitzhugh Lee accepting his commission in the Spanish-American War as a form of reconciliation. And it turns out that Pat Hobby remembers when he was wealthy enough to have met the president of the United States when he was a successful writer. And he imagines Fitzhugh Lee meeting the president, but he is so bitter at the end that he ends up writing, and the one line he adds to the script is, Lee, Mr. President, you can take your commission and go straight to hell. Right. So he imagines Lee refusing that reconciliation. And Fitzgerald had all these weird, complicated relationships with the South. But I was just thinking about this, is right, that people were struggling with this idea of, does the United States need an external enemy in order to be unified, in order to put the Civil War behind us? Because certainly in the 1890s, that was the argument that was made.
Yes, and the Spanish-American War, certainly. I mean, if we had perhaps our most conventionally imperial moment, that the Spanish-American War, and this was part of the speeches, part of the president's speeches, the idea that, yes, this once for all could unite North and South. Of course, North and South were also united in all of the Indian wars as well.
Right. Also true. And you mentioned, because this is one of the other things I want to make sure we brought in, we have about 10 minutes to go, but you talk about the role of war memory and veterans in the American Western, and the American Western movies, especially beginning the modern Western starts with Stagecoach in 1939, but certainly in the post-war era, it really takes off for a while there in the 1950s. And you mentioned both John Wayne and Jimmy Stewart as examples of showing the complexity, how many of their stories involved war veterans. And especially Jimmy Stewart, if you want to talk about those, his adult Westerns with Anthony Mann.
Yes, so their collaborations, their 5 films they made after Stewart returned from his own World War II service as a very different actor, I think. Mm-hmm. Their collaborations on those Westerns is, I think, really remarkable. Most of the time, I think, post-war Westerns are read as Cold War allegories, or often they are. Yeah. And certainly they have that. But what I see in them, because many of them are being made at the same time as these film noir and other films talking about veterans and post-war, is yet another way of working out the veterans' homecoming. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And in those Westerns, it is frequently the case, often Southern Confederate veterans, who come home and find that whatever had been theirs, a ranch, cattle, a farm, a wife, home, is gone, has been taken from them. And so we get a lot of lost cause nostalgia. We get a lot of, Yankee carpetbaggers and everything else, all part of the Southern Memorial engine. But we also get, in a more general sense, this real disillusion and disappointment in the idea that the veteran has been cheated of something. Mm-hmm. And you see that in the films of the 30s that discuss World War I veterans. Mm-hmm. And then you see it in these 2 distinct genres of the film noir, which is dealing with World War II veterans, and of the Western, which projects things back onto the Civil War and thus sort of diffuses them. But I read them as being post-World War II ways of working out the GI's return. Mm-hmm.
I'm sure you get these kinds of questions a lot, but I'm going to ask it anyway. But with an apology in advance. And that is, you read a lot of books and you watched a lot of movies to write this. Are there particular novels or films that you think that you would like your audience to really, after they've read Looking for the Good War, of course, that they should read to understand some of these themes that you've talked about?
Well, as it happens, I have a long list of recommended books and films at the end of Looking for the Good War. So I could point people there. I've mentioned a few of those, some neglected, some not, of those works that I think deserve further attention. But rather than reciting this long list, I suppose I guess I could urge people just to take a look at that. There's several pages of those recommendations.
That's fair.
Yeah.
Well, that's fair. And I guess so to wrap up, right, this idea is we try to figure out. So as the generation that fought the Second World War passes, and as the children of that generation, right, we all get older all the time, right? What happens to the memory of war when it is no longer in the living memory of living people? And this is, is the fact that the Civil War can still be with us to the extent that it is long after the last veteran is gone. Does that show that there are just some conflicts that live on no matter what? Or does the type of living on change? And what should we expect for the memory of the Second World War as the inexorable generational change continues?
Well, I suppose part of my point in writing the book was that the memory of World War II is maybe still negotiable, still up for grabs, that it is just recent enough that we can do that work of excavation.
Right.
As I said, we've started to do the work of excavation of the Civil War, but it's taken a very long time, and it's in granite and brass and buildings, and it is so much a part of the landscape that it's very hard to remake that, to rethink that, because it's just in the air all around us. And maybe I could answer this by going further back in time.
Sure.
To the revolution, because I end the book with Lincoln, mm-hmm. and with Lincoln's attitude toward what he called the Iron Man of the revolution. And of great interest to him, really beginning in the 1830s and carrying on until the outbreak of the Civil War, is this idea of what we do with these earlier generations. And for him, this was the greatest generation that the antebellum period knew, the great patriots of the revolution. And he valued them tremendously, particularly Washington. Mm-hmm. But he also suggested that their virtues were not the virtues that were in demand at the moment. So when he's looking out over the landscape and seeing riots and lynchings and various examples of civil insurrection, he says that what we need now is cold, sober reason. The heroes of those iron men of the revolution, they were full of passion and vengeance, feelings of vengeance against the British. Those won't do us any good now. And of course, we see passion and vengeance break out tragically during his presidency, right, in the Civil War. And no one felt the tragedy of that more than Lincoln. But this idea that the virtues of one generation pass away, the other element to that was, for him, the power of a changing demographic, in that no longer could most Americans, by the time he was writing and thinking about this, trace some kind of genealogy back to the founding generation. Because many people were newly arrived and had no connection. He says no connection by blood. Instead, and this is part of his great campaign to celebrate the Declaration, instead they had a connection to the documents, to the founding documents, and to the power and promise therein.
Gosh, there are so many other questions that are out there that we could talk about, but I'm afraid that we have just about used up our whole hour. Elizabeth Samet, your students are very lucky to have you to lead them in these kinds of conversations. It's been a real pleasure to be able to talk about these sorts of things with you. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Ron. It was a real pleasure to talk to you.
It really was. And ladies and gentlemen, please thank you for your questions, for your engagement. Looking for the Good War is available in bookstores now. We encourage you to go out and take a look and to read all of it, but then you can also get that list of recommended texts at the end. We thank you so much for your attendance. FPR would like to thank our sponsors and partners for their generous support, and for all of you for joining us here on Zoom. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of your questions, but I hope that your curiosity has been further inspired by this discussion. I'm happy to say that this program marks the beginning of our 10th year with such programs, first as Geopolitics with Granieri and now as People, Politics, and Prose. FPRI is grateful to all of you for making these past years possible. We look forward to doing these things for much longer, and we hope that you will consider supporting the work of FPRI, because today's conversation is just the beginning, and we would like to be able to welcome you to future events, and we'd like you to think about the possibility of becoming a member or partner of FPRI so that you can tell a friend about programs like this, and you can bring a friend next time when we gather to analyze our complex world. To keep up with future episodes of People, Politics, and Prose and other events at FPRI, please visit our website, fpri.org, like us on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter. You can follow the host of this program on Twitter at Ronald Granieri. Look forward to welcoming you again sometime, but until next time, for all of us at FPRI, I'm Ron Granieri. Thanks for joining us.